Hey ane e yanga yanga ahia. Hey ane e yanga.
Growing up, ceremony has always been a part of my life. I remember sleeping behind my parents in the teepee during some of these ceremonies. In the early morning when the sun was starting to rise in the east, my mother would bring in water to be blessed by the sacred fireplace. To this day, the smell of cedar and sweetgrass brings me back to this time in my childhood. I grew up on the borders of the Navajo Nation, playing in the San Juan River, climbing the hills, squishing my toes in the mud of irrigated fields. I didn't know it then, but I was lucky. I was surrounded by the rich teachings of my Dene culture and for an appreciation for our Mother Earth. Like many Dene families, my parents went to boarding school and learned English and were told to be ashamed of their Dene culture and teachings. But they still remembered. They taught us English and told us, if you're going to make a difference in this world, you have to go to school. Take what you learn and help our people. My first realization about the imbalance in our Native communities came in 2009. In midwifery school, when I was sitting amongst my classmates, I was the only Navajo and the second Native woman to go through the graduate program. I always heard them talking about all the nice options non-Native women had to get prenatal care and to birth in places called birth centers. They talked about midwives like Ina May Gaskin and the midwifery movement in the United States. I thought to myself, what about our Native midwives and our history? At 30 years old, I began to think about my responsibilities as a mother and my Dene identity. Midwifery school was a huge part of that transformation. It made me think back to my own transition into womanhood, my Kinalda ceremony. I started to really think about what my mother and the women in my community shared with me in the Hogan 18 years earlier. I can easily recall the chill on my skin, the smell of cedar burning, and the yucca root being used to wash my hair. I wanted to know more about all our Navajo teachings and what they meant. So that's when I began learning more about our culture and history. Whenever I went home, I talked to my elders and anybody in my family who could help me. I asked, where were you born? Did we have Navajo midwives? Were there songs, saying, or herbs used? Relatives told me about how their great-grandmothers were born in hogans and shade houses depending on the season. They told me stories about how women's feet were planted in the earth while holding onto a sash belt. Mothers squatted near the fireplace facing east. Meanwhile, the father was making the baby's cradle board. They told me the Hogan is a representative of the universe, and the fireplace is the center. If there was a midwife, she was called Baby Medicine Woman, and she would come to help with the birth. These conversations with my elders changed me. I began thinking, where are our Native midwife healers? What happened to our women's medicine? Are our birth ceremonies all gone? In the larger picture, they seem to have disappeared. But in my heart, I know our traditional knowledge is still there, and we can each access it in our own way. I remember my own 3 pregnancies and my mom telling me, use your corn pollen and pray for yourself in the morning. Don't fight with your husband and think good thoughts so your baby will be healthy. I did everything she told me, and I will continue to seek out our traditional ways of knowing and birthing for our Native women today. I can imagine a comfortable place where Native women and families drink Indian tea and develop relationships with their providers. An inviting place where we hang our grandmothers' pictures on the walls and feel proud to be surrounded by their knowledge and teachings. And a sacred place where our babies take their first breath and are surrounded by their families. After their first cry, our babies would hear their mothers and fathers whispering, "Shieja, Shi'away." The Changing Woman Initiative is a vision we have about helping women reclaim their traditional rights of birthing and healing, which have been shaped over generations through our cultures. It follows the example of Changing Woman by providing a powerful transformative pathway for today's women. One part of that initiative is the development of a birth center for our Native women.